Today we're going to be diving into Hulu's latest docuseries, The Fox Hollow Murders: Playground of a Serial Killer. Now, if you haven't heard of this one yet, okay, let me tell you, it is a chilling deep dive into one of the most disturbing cases in Indiana's history. And honestly, it's got like everything that these true crime cases, documentaries, whatever, bring to them. A wealthy family man leaving a double life, a creepy mansion in the woods, and of course a string of disappearances that went ignored for way too long. Today we're going to be talking about the case of Herb Baumeister. Hello, Sofa Squad, and welcome back to the sofa. Psh, that ain't no sofa. Psh, but this is the Paul. Hello, everybody. My name's Paul. If you're new to the channel, if you're not new to the channel, my name still is Paul. If you're doing well, like I said, today we're going to be reviewing the docuseries, The Fox Hollow Murders. This is on Hulu if you want to watch it. What we're going to be doing is just going over some bullet points that I went over while watching it. So if you're new to the channel or not new to the channel, the way that I do these videos is when I watch the docuseries, I just make notes on my phone as we go, and then I come here and use those as reference points to talk about the case, about the docuseries. So with all that being said, let's go on and start reviewing. Now, like I said, this is about Herb Baumeister. Maybe you've heard a lot about or not heard a lot about, but basically this dude's like the Dahmer we never knew about, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to break the series down, right? And we're going to see, what does it get right? Where does it fall short? Most importantly, does it live up to the hype? And was there another accomplice? So go on, let's buckle up and start to get into it. Now, like I said, this is Hulu's docuseries, The Fox Hollow Murders: Playground of a Serial Killer. So it dives into the crimes of Herb Baumeister. Now, he is the suspected serial killer, right? It's from Indiana, and this went throughout the 1990s. Baumeister is believed to have targeted young gay men, luring them to his very beautiful Fox Hollow farm estate. Now, this is where he would allegedly end their lives and conceal their remains, which would later be discovered. Now, the series will talk to people who lived through this time, who knew Herb, who dealt with him at local establishments, etc., etc. Now, also, we did a live chat on this last night, and a lot of people told me that Peter Mon, a lot of you are probably familiar with him if you Google his name. He has numerous channels. He has a great personality. If you don't know him, you'll want to check him out. But he apparently did a video on this because he has like personal experience with this and whatnot. So everyone's like, you got to go listen to Peter's video. You got to go listen to Peter's video. So go check him out for sure for like firsthand, I guess, whatever his experience is. I believe he's from Indiana in this area. As of right now, I have not watched it because it's early the next morning when I'm recording this. But that's going to be on my next thing, is to go watch his videos on it now and see what he says about his, whatever it is that his experience was. And then you'll want to check him out for other stuff as well. He's a real fun guy, real fun content, and again, he has various channels. So anyways, let's get back to Fox Hollow. Now, the series examines evidence, and it looks into the possibility that, maybe Herb didn't do these acts of horror all by himself, okay? That was the big shocker for me in this. Like I said, Fox Hollow Farm, it's the Dahmer that we never heard of, okay, if you know who Jeffrey Dahmer in that case was. Herb would target gay men. This would help him get away with this, as during this time, remember the 1990s, that zone, it's like a very different time. So the fact that this was in this community, this marginalized community, it made cops, it made the community very uncomfortable, right? And so it was kind of this like, we don't want to deal with that. Now, also one thing I like to say and remind everybody is, for these reviews that I do, oftentimes I'll be jumping from narrative to narrative or person to person because I'm literally following how the docuseries presents it. So just know that when I'm like a detective and now back to this person and now this time, I'm literally just following along with how the narration of the review goes. Now, the docuseries starts off with a detective being interviewed, and one of the detectives, guess what was in the background? A signed picture with them and Dolly Parton. So I was like, okay, we are in the right spot. Just thought that was an interesting little tidbit there, random detail. But after that, we're thrown back into Indianapolis in 1993, okay? okay? Now, the city's gay scene, it's pretty quiet, but it's very tight-knit. So back then, like, gay bars weren't just like were bars, right? These were like the lifelines of the community. It was still very much marginalized, and these were very safe places. And one of these places was named Our Place. It's one of the spots. It was where people gathered, and it's what they did. And apparently it's still there today, I believe, at least during the filming of this new docuseries. Well, it's right in the middle of all of it, basically, okay? Now, at this point in time, men are disappearing, okay? Coming and going, whatnot. Now, one of the people in the docu-series, one of the men, he's a bartender and has been a bartender. He, when Herb was coming and doing his thing, sounds like he's still in the bar scene and whatnot, working. He's describing what it was like back then. Now, one thing to keep in mind is during this time, the HIV epidemic is going on, and this is taking out tons of people, okay? And so literally people will be like, all my friends died, like everyone was dead. Also on this whole, other thing going on over here is, the bartender was like, look, back then, again, a lot of people would use fake names. You wouldn't know a lot about people. He even cited a guy he was dating. He was like, it was, a while before I even knew the guy's name. It was just a very different time. But all of this would work to the benefit of people like Jeffrey Dahmer and people like Herb Baumeister and potentially somebody else we're getting ready to talk about in a minute, okay? So when all these guys start going missing, it's just assumed they just died like everybody else was, right? Like from the HIV/AIDS epidemic. And again, this gave cops an excuse to not really care. They're just going away and whatever, But then people, family members, whatever, they start showing up with missing people posters and they start popping up all over town. Have you seen this person? Have you seen him? We're looking for so-and-so. And then that's when people start realizing, they're like, well, wait a second. Guys aren't just dying from the disease or whatever, like they're just gone. They're, disappearing. So now, flash forward to the summer of 2023. The docuseries introduces us to the cousin of a man named Alan Livingston. He disappeared in 1993. And that's where we start revisiting this timeline of the missing men. There's a bunch of 93 that go missing. There's a bunch of 94 that go missing. There's a bunch of 95. And at this point, it's clear, okay, this isn't random. This isn't a disease. This is a pattern. Something is going on here. Now, his mom, I was telling the gentleman we just talked about, she always felt like Alan, was killed. And even his sister says, her mom knew something was off. Like if he didn't call or show or whatever, that was very odd. And of course, he just obviously stopped at one point in time and nobody ever heard from him again. So this is when she's like, this isn't right. I make a missing persons report. Cops kind of push it to the side, okay? Now, families of the missing men, they kind of get together. They end up hiring a private investigator. And that's really when, the case starts to break off, or not break off, but they start getting, some traction in this, okay? And the traction that they get will eventually all kind of lead to this guy named Herbert Baumeister. So Herb was living this picture perfect life. He has a wife, he has kids. They owned a very successful chain of thrift stores called Save-A-Lot. When his family was out of town, he was living this double life. He was going to this bar scene in Indianapolis. He was cruising. He was looking for young dudes. And one night he will meet a guy named Mark Goodyear. And this is where things start getting really weird and really wild. So Mark Goodyear would originally go tell the police with this huge story, okay? He barely escapes Herb. He says he went back to his house. Something was off. He manages to get away. But then later in the docuseries, we will get a bombshell, okay? And Mark will admit that he actually dated Herb for 2 years. And this whole I escaped story, well, he just made that up to help the police get a search warrant for the property. But here's where things will get murky. Was Mark a victim himself? Was he a hero? Was he something totally different than that? Because as the show goes on, more people start coming forward and they're like, yeah, Mark was there when the murders happened. And they'll also say, he was helping bring people to Fox Hollow Farm. And maybe just maybe, he ain't all that innocent. Okay. Now, Mark will describe meeting Herb, okay? Like, they meet at the bar, whatever. And there's going to be several versions of this story. Well, Mark seems to have several versions of lots of stories. However, there's going to be several versions, okay? So, he'll describe this first meeting, right? The first story we hear, whatever. So he meets her one night at the bar, whatever. They go back to his house and he's talking about going down to this basement and he sees all these mannequins everywhere. They're around the pool, the bar, like everywhere. Now, he will say that Herb will try to give him a drink and that he wouldn't take the drink. He like pretends to take it, okay? And that basically they hook up and he says that Herb is into like, and I can never say this word right, but auto asphyxiation, where you're like, restricting breath and whatnot during adult pleasurable activities. So he'll say that he's into that, okay? So he says that Herb likes that being done to him, like does this to Herb or whatever, but then he says that Herb will try to choke him with the hose. Now, Mark will be like, okay, I was able to get him to stop, and we hook up, we do our thing, whatever, he stops, and he says that he felt like because Herb thought he took the drink that he could get away with doing the hose thing, but he just pretended to take the drink. Well, after all this happens, he's like, so we just went to sleep until Herb could take me home the next day. So pause right there before we go on. My first red flag with this was this. I was like, okay, so this guy tried to choke you out to the degree that you're going to the cops talking about, I want to turn him in, but yet you went to sleep till he could take you home the next day? Now, I get Herb lived way out in this, country estate, whatever. I haven't been there, okay? So it's easy for me to say from the wherever. But I would think if somebody tried to take my life like that I wouldn't feel comfortable falling asleep in their house, right? Like, I would be more like, even if I have to run down the street in my underwear, like, we going home somehow, some way. Right now. Now, eventually a detective will go to the store to the Save-A-Lot to talk to Herb. And he'll even say, like, immediately something's strange with this dude, right? And that Herb's, like, super nervous. Now, he would say that no one knew he went to gay bars. His double life will begin to get exposed. Now, remember, like I said, he has a wife, he has kids, and all this type of stuff, right? Now, remember the bartender I talked about that's kind of been insane? Well, times were recalled of, like, Herb going to the bar. And the bartender would say, he was like, I could tell that Herb, like, hated himself, hated what he was, but on the same note, he's like, I had no idea that this dude had a wife, kids, etc. And like, when they were out of town, he's over here cruising, doing all this. They will eventually down the road at some point get a search warrant and go to the house and do this. At a certain point, the wife, she starts divorce processes. They separate, they do stuff, whatever. And she's like catching on to his ways and whatnot. Now, she'll start talking about like, some red flags and whatnot, and a huge red flag, but at the time it wasn't, was in 94, their son and like a friend or something like that found I think it was a skull or a skeleton, I can't remember. I believe it was a full skeleton, or I can't remember, a skull, something like that, in the woods. There was 3 areas behind the house, 3 different sections in like the woods of, let's say, mass graves. Some of them were burned, some of them were not. There was a creek area, but like it was literally just tens of thousands of bone fragments all over this property, okay? So when the kids bring the skull up or whatever, obviously she calls Herb and she's like, hello, there's a skull. And of course he brushes this off. He's like, no, that's my dad's. That's like something they use at the doctor's stuff at the hospital or the school or whatever it was. Something like that. He gives some reason, right? Like a medical skeleton skull thing or whatever. So pause there for a second on this docuseries. The one thing I remembered when I started watching this, first of all, this story has been told over the years many times, right? Many different ways and many different shows. I had never seen anything that delved this deep into the dynamic of Mark, but I remember seeing lots of stuff with the wife and how, when this first happened, people were kind of coming after her of, why didn't you turn somebody in over the skull? Because it was kind of just brushed off. And again, I don't know these people personally. I wasn't there. I don't, so there's that. I'm just literally armchairing it, right? But my memory of it was this thought process that Herb was so manipulative and kind of kept her in this very certain, like, don't question it. Here's the answer. We don't go past that. Now, clearly at a certain point, she starts separation proceedings and whatnot because there's too many red flags and signs going on. Okay. But I just remember that from previously of like, that was a focal point of being like, these major, like, you didn't think anything of this, that, or the other. And so I found that interesting, but this docuseries doesn't delve too much into, like, say, her perspective. It's more Mark's perspective. So if you go find older content on it, you can probably get ones that are told more from her point of view of it, because it is, again, a very interesting point of view to hear that side of, you know, Herb's secret life. So fast forward a little bit, the police finally get the search warrant, okay? They find thousands of human bones on the property, handcuffs, burn pits. And you know what else is wild? No, they're skulls. Okay, like, where are they, right? Now, were they destroyed? Did somebody else, maybe even, I don't know, Mark or something, dispose of them elsewhere? We'll never know, okay? Julia, the wife, she wants to get their son back. So during this time, like, Herb, whether his son's visiting or whatever, he has one of the kids, right? So clearly she's like, yeah, not a good idea. So she goes to court, whatever, she gets custody back. Okay, so what does this do? This leaves Mark all by himself now. And there's that. Now, keep in mind this, like I said earlier, this isn't really to take it seriously. The prosecutors, they're like, yeah, we don't have enough evidence to arrest him yet. We can't really do all that. And it's just like, okay, he's not even named a suspect, right? So now think about this. Now Herb is all by himself. What would you do? The cops aren't even like doing any surveillance on you. So he does what most people probably would do. He vanishes, okay? He flees to Canada. And what do you think was probably the best thing for him to do at that point? Because he certainly did it. He unalives himself. But before he does this, he leaves a note. Now, no, it's not a confession. It's none of that, okay? It's just like a rambling letter about his failing business, and then also a warning about, Mark Goodyear. It's almost like he was trying to set Mark up to take the fall. Investigators go to Canada, then they retrieve his body. Now, here's another thing. So days before the unaliving, he's stopped by the cops, okay? And he apparently had like this big box of videotapes in the car. Well, when they find his, you know, his body, his remains, whatever you want to call it, there is, you know, the videotapes are gone, okay? And like I said, they just find this note, but there's no confession in it. So again, cops are just kind of investigating, just kind of brushing this off like, okay, well, I guess that's what happened to all these disappeared people. We'll just kind of keep going. But, you know, families don't have answers. And Alan's mom, remember Alan who we talked about? Well, you know, she's like, I'm sorry, but I still feel like, you know, Herb killed my son. I'd like to know. So fast forward to 2023, the investigation gets like ramped up again. And the coroner, I can't say that, is trying to identify the bone parts and bring answers. We start like getting, you know, pushback from the councilman. Like a councilman reaches out to him and is like, this is costing taxpayers a lot of money. You know, we don't need to be spending money on this. Like, if the victim's family and friends want to know if those remains are their loved ones, they can pay to test the DNA on this, okay? So at this point, we have so many questions. Herb has unalived himself. All the unanswered questions to go with that. But also at the center of this is, how did he do this by himself? How did he get the bodies there by himself? How did he pull all this off? Was there an accomplice? So this is where things will kind of take a turn. Now, fast forward to 2024, we meet Rob Graves. Yes, okay, the new owner. You can't make that up, that name. So Rob will say, you know what, I never really had an interest in serial killers until I bought this house. And he's talking about like all the stuff of the Herb and the family that was left behind in the house. And he's like seeing things like on the internet, like thing from his faucet is sold on this, you know, buy stuff from serialkillers.com kind of a place or whatever. Rob will go on to write a book, 2019, The Horrors of Fox Hollow Farm. And he writes it about like himself, the house, you know, his experience with the whole 9 yards, right? So to me, there's a little bit something odd about him just kind of falling into place in this place or whatever you want to call it, but that's here nor there. That's just my opinion. Now we'll also meet a journalist. Her name's Laura. She did a lot of reporting on this when it was going on, and she'll say straight up, the case was botched. This was not right. We also see that investigators start doing DNA swabs of like the missing men's family. They're trying to get, you know, a match results up and whatnot. Now another odd thing that was like a viewpoint into Herb is we'll see this old TV interview that he did, and he's complaining about this dead raccoon that was painted over on the roadway. So like when they go paint the yellow and white lines, he did this whole thing where he photographed how there was a dead raccoon in the way they didn't get out and move it or anything like that. And it was such this odd thing, but then they'll talk about past stories about how he was fascinated with dead animals. So there's that. Another thing we learned too is 6 months after Herb and Julie marry, Herb's super depressed and his dad has to commit him for like 50 days. Now, my take on it will be that he didn't want to be married to Julia. He wanted to be doing his other life, but whatever it is, society, whatever, he goes and does this and it is what it is. Clearly, we know he's harboring some pretty messed up stuff, up here too, right? Herb and Julia, they make good money from the thrift stores, okay? They are living very nicely. Now, a former friend and co-worker will say, like, and a lot of people had this story about Herb in the docuseries. He'll be like, he was, hardworking, but very weird. He had a skeleton hanging on the back of his office door. One day he calls someone in there to the office and he shows them like this rotting food in his drawer, and he thought that was really interesting to show off. And tons of mannequins around the thrift store, which yes, you would expect that to some degree, but I'm talking like in the back room, in the bathroom, in the offices, to where people are like, we can't even move around in here. Now, one of the victim's sisters, she worked for Herb at the thrift store and was working there when her brother went missing. He was there too. So you can only imagine. Now, we also will see from a paranormal ghost team that comes in, they do like a focus on Fox Hollow. The new owner lets them in. And this is where we start interacting with Mark Goodyear. So his name gets brought up. This comes into the whole thing about, how he went to the police. Now, the new owner, Rob, has met Mark about 10 years ago, and he, said that Mark showed them what happened that night, walked through and everything. So the paranormal team, they'll finish filming, and then they reach out to Mark and start interacting with him. And this is when he drops a bombshell and says that he dated Herb for like 2 years. Now, he'll tell them, I made this story up about getting attacked and getting away, and I only did that so that I could get a search warrant to be taken out on the property. Now he'll be like, look, I wasn't involved, but Herb would tell me what he did with the victims, and he would tell the story about how Herb uses tool to extract people's teeth, and he tossed them down the hallway to make this noise, and just kind of odd, bizarre stuff. One of the victims' sisters will say about Mark that she personally thinks that he helped to bring victims to the home. We'll talk about my opinions on that in the very end. Now, the documentary team will take this information because Mark is as the kids say, totally sus, right? They decide they're going to almost do a trap in a way, and they decide they're going to film at Fox Hollow for obviously, a docu-series or whatever they're doing, and they're going to have Mark come in to kind of vibe him out. Now, Mark's like, I don't want to show my face. And they're like, okay, that's cool, but he will later. They're walking through the house, and he points out from this kitchen area, there's this outdoor little area, and he's like, right over there, I saw a burn pile, and it had human figures and body parts in it. Okay. But even then he chose to stay. And these are the things that start coming up with Mark's story. That when you just listen to it superficially, it's very odd, because there's multiple times where a lot of times if you saw even one sliver of what he's talking about, you would run screaming for the hills, but he almost welcomes it in. Now, the documentary team will be honest, and they're like, we can't tell if he's part of this or if he's just making it up, okay? Now, the new owner of the house will say that Mark told him he saw bodies there back in 96 or something. So soon after Herb taking his life, a transcript surfaces, and it's a phone call with Herb and a detective or something like that. And Herb's in this thing saying he got involved with someone, and someone's name is Mark Goodyear, and that he's a really bad person, and that, Herb's afraid that he's going to come for his family once he's gone, and that Mark had stalked him and all this type of stuff. So at this point in the game, in this, docuseries, it's wait, what? Okay, I didn't know any of this stuff, right? So they bring in this detective. He's worked JonBenet Ramsey cases. I mean, the big cases, right? And he's going to work with the coroner to figure out, who are these victims? Who's this Mark guy? This, that, and the other. So they go back over that transcript that we just talked about, and in it, Herb talks about taking his life because of the failing businesses, and then again in this he's mentioning Mark Goodyear. He talks about waking up one night and Mark's trying to strangle him, and that Mark's been stalking him, and again just reiterating the same stuff we just talked about. He's afraid that he's going to come after his family and whatnot. Now in this letter or transcript, whatever, he'll tell his attorney where to get more information about Mark and some other things. He's if you look in this place in the house, but none of that stuff is ever were found. Now, the detective thinks, what's going on here? Is Goodyear why he's taking his own life? And then he's trying to set up Goodyear to take the fall? Or is he really this involved? Like, what's really going on here? Now, we'll see another man that's being interviewed who had an encounter going back to Herb's house. And they're trying to figure out what happened, who did this. And they'll be like, okay, well, here's a picture of Herb. Is this the dude that, you took you out there? And he's like, no, that's not him, okay? But then they'll show him Mark Goodyear, and he's like, yeah, that's the dude right there. He was house sitting for his boss, and he took me back to his boss's house or whatever. So and this a chain of events unravels, okay? This is where Mark's name starts very much fluctuating through the grapevine on this, right? Now, they talk about Mark Goodyear's interview at one point, and this is the interview that he did with the cops, that initial one where he's like, look, I had to, do what I had to do to get this search warrant. So the detective that was brought in was listening to Mark describe the auto asphyxiation and things like this, right? And the cops the detective's this doesn't add up. This is more strangulation. And he's like, you wouldn't know this unless you've seen it or done it. And he's like, this story doesn't add up overall, okay? At all. And I guess one thing from that, now that I think about it, so if you're into just taking someone's breath away or your own breath for gratification versus what somebody's body would go through if they were being strangled to death, I'm assuming and hoping those are two different processes, with bulging eyes and extremities and things like this. I don't know, right? But that's how I kind of interpreted what this detective is talking about. So Mark will talk about how, let's switch back over to him for a second. He and Herb traded numbers. He invited him over for dinner once, and it's you listen to these stories mixed in with the other things we've talked about with Mark and Herb from Mark's mouth. And it's why would you invite someone over that's stalking you, that tried to kill you, that tried to do this, that tried to do that? It doesn't add up. And this detective sees that. Now, another part of the story that doesn't add up is when Mark's walking through Fox Hollow and showing them everything. And he goes through something and he's like, I felt like Herb wanted to shoot me. Okay, he had guns up in here. And how would he know he had guns? Because that will become prevalent with some of the evidence that they find. Now, switching to another perspective, a son of one of the victims speaks about his dad going missing and the possible connections of how his dad knew Herb. He thinks that his dad had an acquaintance with Herb. His dad was married to a guy, not the typical victim of Herb's, but the acquaintance to Herb is none other than who? Guess. Mark. Okay, you see how he's tied in with all this stuff on various levels. Now, Herb, they will determine the detective whatnot is very calculated in who he picks. And I would think you would have to be to get away with this for this long. Now, at one point, this detective that's been brought in, he'll ask the new owner for his opinion on Mark Goodyear. And he's at this time, he's I feel like Mark's a hero. He didn't think that Mark hurt anyone. He's Mark's definitely, a showman and likes to embellish a lot. And we'll talk about that here in a minute. Let's talk about some of that evidence. It's whatever. So, again, when they're finding these bones and stuff like this, they find handcuffs, they find shotgun shells in the woods, and they think maybe men were walked back there. Because remember, they're sitting here trying to figure out how did Herb do this all by himself? He had to have an accomplice to get, dead weight back to this area. And they're like, well, wait, he could have just walked people back, right? And taken them back there. All these things start to add up. Also remember how Mark was I felt like he had a gun and wanted to kill me. Where they're that's part of the evidence that was found. Now, granted, you could have easily found this out at this point, but, nonetheless, we'll get into it in a minute. Now, they talk about another witness who went onto the property. His drink is laced. Mark Goodyear is there, and he will say that Herb ends up shooting someone in front of him with a shotgun of some variety, and then he's I just take off running, right? But he says that Mark Goodyear held the victim's arms while Herb shot him, and it sounded like this very bizarre situation. Now, whether that's true or not, I do not know, or if that's a variation of the truth, I do not know. So essentially, Mark Goodyear's name continually comes up time and time again in association with Herb, okay, and all this stuff going on. Now, Mark will eventually agree in this current thing to be interviewed and show his face. And he is so odd, his behavior. And he's basically well, I want to know if the audience thinks that I'm the elusive killer. And he does it in such a weird way. Okay, now I'm not a therapist, I'm not a doctor, I'm not anything, but I was getting like extreme, I don't know if like narcissistic vibes is the correct word for this, but like that kind of a vibe from this guy. Like when Rob, the new owner, said he's a showmanship kind of guy and likes to embellish, that was being nice, okay? Now, Mark will say, you know what, I'm not afraid to show my face now, I'm not as scared of anyone anymore, so on and so forth. And they're back at the farm, okay? Apparently after an interview that Mark did for Annie, like this is in the past or whatever, he was then considered a suspect, but nothing really came of it. There seems to be this untouchable aspect of this case. Let's talk about this for a second. And again, I don't know him personally. This is just an opinion based on what I saw from the very public docuseries. But he seems to very, very much like the attention that he is getting in this, okay? And I think that paints a lot of what we see him talk about and discuss. Again, we'll get into some more of that here in a minute, but I just want to, go ahead and paint the canvas with that. Mark will retell the story he originally told the police. Remember, like he escapes or whatever. So he's like, yep, I meet Herb at a bar. Herb staring at a wall of posters of all the missing men at the bar. Mark talks to him about it. They walk out the back door. They eventually get in Herb's car. They go to the farm. He says Herb had a bunch of coke. He says that Herb didn't attack him, but that he used the pool vacuum and like gently touched his neck or something, or his throat, and then he took it away. Now, on the back porch, he said he felt like Herb was going to kill him. He'll also talk about how there was like a burn pile with embers and clear human forms in it. And he felt like Herb was trying to get a rise out of him by like walking around the house and showing him this stuff. But he didn't act bothered. He tried to act like, okay. Now I'm trying to wrap my mind around trying to be like playing it off like there's a pile of like burning bodies. And you're like, yeah, that doesn't bother me. Right? So anyways, they go back to the pool. Mark slips Herb something. Herb gets knocked out. Then when Herb comes back to, he's like, that really turned me on. Now again, why not escape? It's again another one of these stories that he tells. It's very odd. Now, he'll talk about how this pool area is always foggy and that Herb would play these weird games and that Herb would like have these things that he wanted you to recite. And it's things like, talking about eyes bulging out and things of this nature. And it's things of, it sounds to me like describing somebody being strangled, okay? Now, he'll also say that Herb told him that he killed 56 men. Then Mark is asked about the videography. What's up with, the videotapes and all this type of stuff? And Mark will tell a story about how there's this like, vent up in the ceiling or whatever that had a hidden video camera in it that looked down on this chase lounge somewhere. Then Mark's very like evasive about other things. He's evasive about a relationship that he had with Herb. He doesn't want to talk about it. He'll say this oftentimes where he's like, I don't want to, no, not today. I don't want to talk about that. And he'll kind of scoot past it. And he'll say that Herb stalked him. And he'll say that Herb would show up at his grandmother's house while he was there. And so this is what prompted Mark to give Herb his own address so that he would come there and stalk him instead and keep his grandmother out of it. And again, I'm just like, okay. But then, if it was a regular person who didn't have this issue with like embellishing things, I would say, well, maybe they tried calling the cops and the cops were like, too bad. You never know. So when Mark's talking about Herb stalking him, he's like, well, I stalked him right on back. You can believe that, mister. Okay. Now, Mark would also say, oh, I tell everyone at the bars, I'd be like, don't go home with him. He's the killer. Don't go home with him. He's the killer. He was like, I would call the police in front of Herb and Herb would be like, no one's going to believe you. I'm a married man with a very established business. You're just a little sissy boy. Again, I don't personally believe those stories. I think they might be a kernel of truth in them, but I think Mark's kind of embellishing them. So they bring canine dogs onto the property to, look for bones and this, that, and the other and whatnot. So they show all this going on. Now, Mark will also say that when the cops searched Herb's property and the news showed all the bones that they started breaking, that Mark was at his house watching it with them and that he had a gun and was pissed off and Mark was afraid that he was going to kill him. So another thing that's kind of woven into this is it seems like Mark enjoys like the attention, but also being in such close proximity to such a volatile story. Like, oh, he was at my house when that happened. That kind of a thing. Now they also asked Mark about this box of videos and stuff, and he won't talk about that. Now the director also asked Mark if Mark thinks that Herb killed himself. And he's like, I don't want to talk about that. I don't want to do 25 years. And this is one of the things where I'm like, okay, hold up, wait a minute. Again, Mark likes divulging what he wants to divulge, it seems. He has these little tidbits that he throws out like breadcrumbs to keep people going and coming back. Now, another dynamic of this is that, we don't know if Mark's getting paid by these people. You see what I'm saying? Like, I had to start questioning that because part of me was like, this almost is starting to feel like someone is taking kernels of truth, embellishing them to keep something going. And why would you keep something going? You either love the attention, you're getting paid along the way, something, right? But this whole thing where he's always kind of insinuating himself into major things, why would you do that? Now they talk about this other witness, okay, who says that he saw someone killed and that Mark Goodyear was the one like who held the dude down that was killed or whatever. Okay, so they start asking, they're like, what we're going to do? We're not going to just like blurt this guy's name out to Mark. We're going to slowly work him up to it. So they start going through all these like names of the past and asking him, and then they get to this guy and they're like, and what about so-and-so? And Mark's like, yeah, I remember, Well, they tell him about this dude calling the cops and they read the statement, and this is about like, hey, I saw Mark hold somebody down while they got shot. And Mark's like, he denies it, which is kind of surprising. And he's like, oh, that must be a different person. No, but this witness described Mark down to a T. Also, the witness describes the house in detail. Now, Mark accuses this guy of being like a liar, and Mark is basically like, and he's trying to be like, let's say politically correct or whatever, but he's like, this dude's attention seeking, and he's like, this dude's lacks like the mental capacity to believe him, and that he probably wanted money for the interview. And so this is where some of the things I think are probably Mark telling on himself, because I think some of the things could probably be true for Mark as well. Now, I don't know about the mental capacity thing, but definitely the attention. And then I'm just guessing Mark was making money off this. I think that's part of his continuing to go on and on about it and creating this crazy tall tale of keep coming back to me. Now, I'm not saying what he's saying is lying, but I think he's benefiting from it in some capacity. I just don't know what. Now, overall, Mark will deny that he ever set anyone up to be killed, okay? Now, the victim's family members, they'll all kind of get together and go to Fox Hollow for closure, which I think was really nice of the new owners to offer to these people. Now, there's also been a memorial that's been made for the victims, and so there is an acknowledgement of it, but still this undercurrent of hush, hush, brush it away, let's move on. Now, let's stop. That's kind of like the main notes that I made from it. I just want to offer some of my opinions on it on the most asked questions, especially from the live chat that we did last night. So the biggest thing, do I think Mark Goodyear is involved? Yes. To what capacity? I don't know. Again, this is allegedly. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a cop. I'm just making opinions based on very public stuff. I think at minimum, Mark probably was bringing people to the house and acted as like the bait, if you will, and was doing that. At most, he could have been helping Herb right alongside of him. Would I be surprised to find out that Mark was holding someone down and doing that? No. Would I be surprised to learn that he made it up? No. So I do not think anybody will ever know what took place because of the way that, well, first of all, key players are now dead, right? But the cops don't have any real interest, not the majority of them, in looking into this. Bless the coroner's heart for trying to, do things right by these family members. But at the time of it, it was like nobody wanted to deal with this or talk about it. Now, again, with Mark, I would need to know the full story. Is he getting paid? Does he make money off all these interviews he's doing? Why is he changing his story constantly? And if he was involved in it, why would you be admitting to some things unless you had an entitlement or a confidence and a cockiness that came with, I'm untouchable? And if that is true, what gave him the authority, the confidence, the cockiness to feel like he can just kind of be out there putting his stuff out there and ain't nothing gonna happen to him, right? We might not ever know. So, but what I am curious about is to know what you think. Oh, I'm dying to hear from you about this. Okay, let me know. Do you think Mark had something to do with it? What level of involvement do you think he did, if you do? Okay, I want to hear about it in the comment section. I will be reading them, so just drop it on down there. And while you are down there dropping that off, if you could please drop some little sofas off for Roscoe and Spirit, for Bo and Luke, and well, the rest of the Sofa Squad. We need a place to sit to talk about Mark and Herb, Casey, Anthony, all these cases and people we talk about here at the Sofa Squad. And until we meander our own way down there in that comment section to do all that, I'll see y'all soon. I just wanted to say thank you again for watching the whole video, and also thank you for being part of the Sofa Squad. Special thanks to all the Patreon members, channel members from both of my channels, everybody who likes, shares, subscribes, comments in the comment sections. It helps the channel out so much. Now don't forget, I do have that other channel, the podcast channel. That's where we go live, we hang out, we talk. We have kind of sort of a schedule, but just be sure and check it out. I'll put it up here on the screen. And then like I said in the beginning of the video, if you want to follow me and Ross on the Instagram, go on, check it out. It's right here on the screen again. But once again, thank you very much. I really appreciate you being part of the Sofa Squad, and I'll see you in the next video.